Good evening and welcome. The North Carolina Business Committee for Education and the North Carolina Virtual Public School are proud to host the North Carolina Career Connections Speaker Series. The speaker series includes presentations about career paths and jobs by those working in the field. We feel that it is never too early to start thinking about your future, and we are now providing a platform for our students to gain insight and exposure to potential career paths while still in middle or high school. And this evening, we are really excited to have Lola Culler with us. She worked in and for Old Salem for about 22 years, over a period of about 28 years with a couple of breaks. During that time, she worked under the tenure of 4 presidents of Old Salem. Mrs. Culler was employed in 3 different departments at Old Salem, in education, retail, and group tours. She served as an historic interpreter and guide, the manager and buyer of Old Salem Furniture and Accessories. She worked in merchandise and customer service as the manager at Teabaggy Merchant, J. Bloom, and the gallery shop for changing exhibits. Mrs. Culler also worked as the workshop museum educator. She was the program coordinator part-time while she worked on her master's degree at UNC Greensboro, where she worked in semesters in science and architecture with a concentration in museum studies and historic preservation, while she simultaneously worked on developing a school outreach program for elementary students. She worked as well in group tours with some marketing and work with their website. So lots to talk about this evening. Thank you so much for being with us. And I just wanted to start with what interest that you had, which led you in this direction of working in historic preservation and museums.
Hello, everyone. It's great to see you. I am so glad that Catherine is involved in doing this, because when you learn my career path, you'll go, goodness, she needed this. My path here, getting to Old Salem, was very circuitous in the first place. I started off in high school and first bachelor's degree thinking I was going into nursing, and I had a psychology background. Then my boyfriend, husband now for 44 years, said, you shouldn't be going that direction. You have the best looking dorm room on campus. You should be going into interior design. I went, I've never thought of that. So I went back to school, got a 2-year degree in interior design. And so my career and my profession for many years was in interior design. My husband and I owned a retail shop that carried a number of items and had an interior design studio as well. So I did that for a number of years. There was a point in my interior design career, even though I loved it and loved working with my clients, but I honestly got frustrated with interior design. It was a period where things were really difficult to order. Prices were fluctuating so wildly. It was crazy. And I just decided I want it out. And there was a lot of conspicuous consumerism was the term at that time. And I didn't feel comfortable with just throwing all that money on silk fabric at the windows, to be honest with you. 2 friends who worked at Old Salem at the time, I just made incidental contacts with them. One of them was in costume one day when she came by here to bring me something. And I went, Old Salem, that would be a fun place to work. So truly, that's what took me to Old Salem. And I know it sounds just really funny, but my path has been really crazy to get there. I hated history growing up, hated it. So for me to have ended up at a historic site is really laughable, and having loved it so much. And I think I just didn't have good history teachers. And I think just the study of history has changed so much in my lifetime that it's also such a totally different field of study now, even. And that sounds, again, like an odd thing to say, but the study of history has truly changed. So yeah, what got me to Old Salem was really strange. And I wouldn't even say it's been a career at Old Salem, because again, it has been, my time at Old Salem has been I've had my fingers in a lot of different pies.
No, I think that's wonderful for students to hear that even if they have an interest or don't have an interest, to not close those opportunities that might come their way and just be open to their career maybe being, as you said, you know, varying and kind of weaving and moving in directions that you might not have even imagined when you were thinking about
Indeed,
nursing.
indeed.
Very cool. So, what did you enjoy most about all of these very different jobs and responsibilities you had at Old Salem?
I would have to say the people. Historically, the people who lived in Salem, their stories are fascinating, and that's what drew me in so much. But my coworkers, and that's where I met Miss Michelle, by the way. We worked together for a few years. But my coworkers, most of them, I will say there were a few exceptions. My coworkers were a joy, and some of them have become lifelong friends.
Very cool. So, how about the visitors who came to Old Salem? Did you enjoy interacting with them?
Always, and the parts of my job I think that I enjoyed most were those aspects where I interacted most directly. My favorite position that I had at Old Salem was working as a workshop educator, costumed, doing the hands-on tours for school children. So we were working with pottery and dyeing and weaving, and we were doing all those things and showing them how they were, how those were done historically, and carrying buckets of water and loads of firewood. It was not a great paying job, and it was physically a demanding job, but that was truly my favorite thing to do. It was wonderful. And just seeing the children's faces truly light up as they made that connection between, well, this is odd, but I can see how I do that same task, but in a different way today, or with different tools, and just those connections lighting up is always
Yeah,
fun.
and I bet. And I think that goes back to what you were saying about history being taught in a different way today,
Yes, yes,
and looking more at what was life like daily for the people as opposed to just focusing on the leaders and the laws and wars.
yes.
So did you find some surprises when you were working there over those 22 years that you didn't expect when you first had your friend come to the door and she was wearing the costume and you thought, oh, that would be a fun place to work?
Um, yes, and there's sort of two ways that I look at this. One is by looking at Old Salem as the institution and that working mechanism, if you will, that keeps it alive. And one is the historic town of Salem. And I think a lot of people don't recognize that when we talk about Old Salem, we are talking about the Living History Museum today and the study of the people who lived in the town more than 200 years ago, but the town itself was just called Salem. So some of the surprises, one, in terms of the institution of Old Salem, I didn't realize at the time how many people were employed there. And when I first started working there, there were close to 300 people employed in various jobs. So it's an enormous amount of work to keep a place running, just the buildings kept together because they're old buildings, to keep the grass cut, to keep the retail stores staffed and merchandise coming in, to do the education. That's what most people see is the interaction with the costumed interpreters, but there's so much behind the scenes as well. So one was just the number of staff originally, and that has definitely cut back over the years for various reasons. But the other real surprise was the depth of history of the town of Salem. over the years, when other people from other museums would come in, they would just be amazed. Well, how do you know this particular detail? That we can give a very specific day, that a specific event occurred at a specific location in Salem. And they say, how do you have all this information? And that's simply because the Moravians, they were the founders of the town of Salem. It was basically the Moravian church. They kept such extensive records, volumes and volumes and volumes and volumes of things like what crops were harvested today, what the weather was like today, what the church services were, who was wanting to open this particular trade, who was in trouble because they had done this, that, or the other. So it's all the wonderful stories of life, just daily life, that are to me just fascinating. And because the Moravians kept such amazing records, which were originally in German, the language that was spoken there until the middle of the 1800s, there are still records which have never been translated. So there is still more information to learn. And there's always someone doing some kind of research and bringing new research to light, which I find is amazing for a site that's more than 200 years old.
Absolutely. And how much of your time was spent on research and learning, and did you get to actually touch these records and look at them? And
Well, not enough time, because it's something I really fell into again and didn't have any specific training for it. When I went back to get my master's, that was the time that I started learning a little bit more about how properly to do historic research. So there were just various times in my career that I would volunteer to help with a project, or for instance, the Boys School Museum, which was restored in the last few days. I was actually paid to do some of the historic research for that while I was still working in group tours. I just asked if I could split my time, and they allowed me to do that. But there is a lot of research online that you can access easily. The one place I would say, if you really want to do historical research, the volumes of books, they're 13 volumes. They're called the Moravians of North Carolina, the records of the Moravians in North Carolina. If you go to the Old Salem website, there's a link to them. They were published, they were translated going back to the 1920s, and they've been published. And they are all, a lot of these documents that year by year will go through the events of the town of the day. The minister in the town was actually the official reporter of a lot of the daily events. And then there are records of people's travel, some great stories of shipwrecks as people were coming to this country from Europe. There are great stories during the Revolutionary War, when Lord Cornwallis comes into town, or when George Washington comes to visit, or with just some scamps, I think they were called, came into town and were breaking windows and riding a horse into the tavern and causing all sorts of havoc. And it's just fascinating, their receipts, and it's just to go through and just read them, to me, is fascinating.
I bet. I know I could probably get lost, lose an
Yeah.
entire day just looking at those. And we have a question in the chat from Josie. She wants to know what qualifications you have to get in order to work at Old Salem.
Good question, Josie. And it really depends on what job you're applying for. Right now, because Old Salem is technically closed as a museum, I don't know that there are any positions open, but it's always posted on the website. The website is a great resource to go to for a lot of reasons. But if you're looking to work or volunteer there, definitely start with the website. And like I said, there are a lot of behind the scene jobs, there are education jobs, and retail basically is closed, has been closed. Winkler Bakery has just opened. So right now there's just limited availability, even though there are tons of programs ongoing that are online primarily. They have had to cut the staff so severely that I really don't know what may be available. But if you're looking to enter the historical aspect of Salem some way, a degree in public history is probably the avenue most people would take. UNCG does have degrees in public history, I know. And other avenues you might consider is historic preservation, which deals more with the maintenance, upkeep, the study of the building. So keeping up what is historically there and making it historically accurate with new materials. And also just the study and transfer of information to people about, for instance, what fachwerk is and what is a Fleur-Kuchen house, and the architectural terms about what this German architecture means, why is this building half German and half English, or all of that. So historic preservation would be another really great avenue. I would say those are probably the two best avenues. I tried it through the museum studies, but at that time UNCG's program in museum studies just really was not very well developed. So I ended up taking a lot of historic preservation classes, which I ended up loving. If you're interested more in objects, curation, if you are, for instance, wanting to work at MESDA, which is the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts, which is a museum within Old Salem. And I'll maybe explain all of that in more detail later. But for instance, they have collections of furniture and artifacts, material culture that are broader just in the area of Salem and an earlier time period. And so they have, for instance, paintings that need to be restored and curated, or furniture. So there's that whole avenue that you might consider as well.
Josie, feel free to unmute your mic if you have a follow-up question, or any of you feel free to unmute your mic as well if you have questions. Yeah, so jump in anytime. Thanks, Josie, for that question. So I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, Josie, did that answer your question? Okay, good.
Okay, cool. So I wanted, sort of following on Josie's question and what you were just talking about with curation. And I know that you worked as a buyer for Old Salem Furniture and Accessories. So what did that entail? I'm sort of imagining you traveling to all of these places and going through antique stores. I may be way off base here.
No, that's a really good question. While I was working at Old Salem, a line of furniture was developed by Lexington Furniture. These pieces they were actually part of the Bob Timberlake collection, but the Old Salem Furniture collection were pieces that were reproductions of some historic pieces in Old Salem. Some of them were inspirations, in other words, a bed that might have been designed from a gate or something. So there were a variety pieces. And during that time period, Lexington Furniture restored the building, which is J. Bloom House, restored that to be a furniture showroom and store. And so we sold all new furniture and, electric lights and things like that people would use it to buy in their homes today, and the accessories. And because of my background in interior design and my love and knowledge of Old Salem, it was just a perfect marriage for me. So I was traveling to markets, but it was more the traditional furniture and gift markets. And there were times that I would buy a few pieces, a few accessories that were more vintage or antique, that were sort of the type of of items that would have been used historically in Salem, but it was not a period store at all. It was a modern day store that people would buy items that would feel like Salem, but not trying to furnish a home that was historically accurate. So no, that's a good question.
Okay, yeah, so that makes me think my parents, when they were first starting out, they went to Williamsburg a lot and bought furniture and paint and to try to sort of reproduce that look.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Mhm.
Very cool. What about, we talked about some surprises and things that you loved. What about challenges that you faced working there and how did you overcome those?
Well, mentioned that I had worked during the tenure of four different presidents at Old Salem. And I realized looking back that probably in some ways was a surprise and a challenge because presidents or any leader of an organization or institution has a personality. And a lot of times that personality drives what happens in the institution. And during my time there were a few presidents that I felt like brought a lot of negativity to Old Salem. I felt like they did not appreciate the people who worked there. And it sucked a lot of the joy out of working in a place that you dearly loved. So I think that was one of the challenges. But now the president who's there now, Frank Bagnone, I worked under him for about 2 years before I retired. He's been there maybe about 5 years. Frank is one of those people who a lot of people don't like. I think he's a person, people that they love him or just, I'm not so sure about him. I think Frank is awesome. I think what he has done for Old Salem is awesome because he has shaken Old Salem up and Old Salem needed it. But a lot of people who don't like change just, didn't like that. And Frank has brought a much more accepting, inclusive, reaching out, looking at things in a different way, open-minded. His whole personality and the way he does things to me is positive. And I love his energy, even though there've been things that he's done that I've gone, I don't know if I would have done that, you know how you do that. You disagree with the boss. But I feel like he has brought so much positivity and just sort of brought a breath of fresh breeze through Old Salem, which was much, much needed. So the challenges have been, I think, a lot of times, like I say, the head of the organization being negative. But also from time to time, there are challenges just with other coworkers. And I think this is something that we all have to learn, no matter what position, what career path. There are always going to be people that we may disagree with, that may be competitive with us, and we've got to learn how to deal with them and not walk away. Or I feel like that is why teachers so often put you in groups to have to do things, teams or whatever, to have to work on a project. Because I always hated that, because you always have someone who didn't want to do anything. I mean, y'all all know what I'm talking about. But I think that's the purpose for it, is trying to teach you those real life experiences and ways to deal with people, because it is something that you're going to be confronted with, and it's not always easy.
Yeah, definitely. That is the reason for our madness of putting students into groups, even though we know they don't like it. We keep getting told by people in various professions that this is something that needs to be developed. So
Yes.
do you have any advice for when that does happen, whether it's a boss or a coworker, for the students and kind of working with those people who don't share your vision or who are more competitive maybe than they need to be?
Um, I do now. I haven't always handled it well in the past. I'll be honest with you. I think now my advice would be to listen, um, to truly, truly listen. And it's really hard to do that. And we don't always, even when we try to, we don't always listen really well. I just learned the term in the last couple of days of Hayoka, of a position that's actually, I think it's the Dakota indigenous people, that this is an official position within their tribe and an honored position that the person is supposed to represent the opposite in every argument, every discussion, to the extreme that this person will often walk backwards. They may wear furs and woolen and warm clothes in the summertime and very little clothes in the wintertime. So if there is any official discussion among the tribe, their job is to actually present the opposite viewpoint. And I think that's such an interesting concept, to listen for that opposite when it pops up in other situations, even in our own brain sometimes, but listen for that opposite. And when you're dealing with someone maybe that who you feel like is that opposite, maybe more thoroughly listening more deeply at what's behind what they're saying and not just shutting them out, which is so easy to do. And I am very guilty of the not doing it right part. So
Oh, we all are. I think that's interesting. I did not know that about that position.
yes.
Um, that's really cool. Thank you for sharing that. And so we talked about the type of education with Josie's question. What type of training did you receive at Old Salem?
When I started as a historic interpreter and as a guide, um, that was a period of Old Salem's history where we had a really strong president, in my opinion. And it was a time where there was a lot of growth in Old Salem. And there was a large class of interpreters like me who were coming in at one time and training together. And then there was extensive historical training, not just about Salem, but about just the time period. There was a lot of reading and study that was required to start that job. And I feel like over the years that training has sort of weakened a little bit.
Hmm.
It was even in that time period when I first started in the 90s that we had a director of African American study who taught us African dance and African music and the history of the slave trade in ways that I had never learned it as a child. And so that training was very valuable in helping me understand better. And that was before there was an extensive amount of programming that was being developed to tell the story of the African American. It was still more strongly focused on the original European settlers. So I feel like that's where I got my strongest training, was in those earlier years of the historic aspects.
So yeah, and again, something I would love. It's like going back to
Yes.
school.
Yes, it is. And I'm one of those people who, I'm a lifelong learner. I love to sit in on a class or go to a class. I think it's fun.
I do
It's
too. And the students are probably all rolling their eyes at us and thinking,
I know they are.
You
They'll
don't
understand
remember.
one day.
Yeah, right, exactly. I mean, I understand I don't want all the stress and the test and
Right,
the papers and all of that, but just the learning part, definitely.
right, right.
Yes. So what are some personal qualities, characteristics,
Mm.
skills, attributes that you think would be helpful? Like, Josie was asking, someone who's interested in this line of work, whether it's at Old Salem or another historic site anywhere in the world.
Well, the first one on my list we just mentioned was eagerness to learn. So I think that's huge. You've got to be open and really wanting to learn about whatever site or whatever history it is that you're focusing on. And I think the number two that I put down was flexibility. Um, and this is true at Old Salem. And Old Salem is a fairly large historic site. There are a lot of, for instance, house museums that are much, much smaller, or other museum settings that are much, much smaller. But in those settings, if you're not flexible, then you may not have a job as long, because they by nature are often situations where people have to multitask. And if you can be flexible, and if your particular job may be waning or at a seasonal low, but you may be able to step into something else and you become a much more valued member of the team or teams, as it may be.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute. Yeah, I think that's can probably be said just about any job, to
Yeah.
be eager to learn and to be flexible.
Yeah.
In doing this series, I've heard so many people say it's not so much what you already know, but that you're eager to learn.
Yes.
And I think that's part of what's exciting too.
Yeah, I think it is too. Yes. And being a little willing to change too. If you're too, stuck with things being the way they have always been.
Right, as you mentioned, some of your coworkers who weren't necessarily happy with this latest president wanting to kind of shake things up. And I can imagine in an historic site, you need to make it, as you said, more accessible, kind of, and I'm thinking in terms of the internet and having that presence, as well as, that more focus on inclusion, not just the European point of view, which again, I think is what's changed in history, which I'm glad
Right,
in the
right,
study of
right.
history. And you mentioned earlier about volunteering. So, for the students who may not be ready to necessarily work, what are some opportunities? I know we're in COVID time, so things are restricted, but once we come out of that they might be able to get involved in.
Honestly, I can't answer that question right now, because things have changed so much during the time of COVID, how they're doing things. I would just say go to the website. There's always a tab for employment and volunteer opportunities. And if there are any opportunities that are open, then check into those. But I will also tell you that Frank Bagnone, their president, has an open door policy. If you want to email him personally, I recommend that you do it. I think he is the most approachable person I have ever run into as the leader of an institution. So he actually does have periodically, if you go to the website, you'll see there are Frank's updates, but you'll also see there's some archived Ask Me Anythings. So I don't know if it's once a month, but every now and then there'll be a date posted where it's a Ask Me Anything, and it's a time to Zoom, and he will truly answer any questions that are brought up. So be a great way to kind of, either if you just wanted to sit on one, or see one of the past ones, or go, ask him anything. I mean, truly, he means it.
That is really cool.
He's a funny guy, but extremely knowledgeable.
What a cool way to open up Old Salem to
Yes.
lots of different folks.
Yes.
And I will say too that I did an internship at Mesda,
Mhm.
and probably would not have had that opportunity until I said, but I will do it for free.
Yes.
Because they said, well, we don't have any internships. And I said, well, what if we create one and I just come in during the summer for free?
Yes.
Sure, we'll find something for you.
Awesome. Awesome. I didn't know you had done that. We'll have to talk more about that later, or you tell us now if it fits in with what we're talking about.
Well, one of the cool things I got to do was go to the Moravian archives
Oh, yes.
and look at photographs, specifically, the name is just flown out of my head. The type of photography where it was like the two images.
The
You look,
stereoscopic.
Yes,
Mhm.
exactly. Now sometimes I was shelving books in the library, but I also got to help with the presidential China exhibit with
Oh,
helping set
yes,
that up.
yes, yes,
So they really did just, whatever they had going on at
yes,
that point that they needed help with, that
yes,
but it was I learned so much. Um,
yes.
and yeah, once I said I would work for free,
Yeah, exactly,
the door was
exactly.
open.
And you will, it'll be the most, and not only do you learn a lot, but there's a great networking opportunities. And I think sometimes students get tired of hearing that word networking, but a lot of times it is the people that you know that will make a difference. And
Hmm.
if you can just get your, face in front of someone, your name in front of someone, if they see that you're eager to learn and energetic and, want to do more, it will go very far for you.
Absolutely. Yes.
And the Moravian Archives, as an aside, is an amazing place. It's where all those the originals of those historical documents are kept. Those are, it's open to the public, but not really, because the documents are so valuable. If
Hmm.
you are a serious researcher, I recommend that you do some research there, but you do have to make an appointment, and um, they're very careful about how they allow those materials to be seen. However, you can go to Old Salem or Mesa's websites and see a lot of those originals digitally. And it's another great way to do it at home right now and kind of get a taste of things to see if that's even something you want to do.
That's great advice. Oh, sorry, I don't know why I have an echo. Yeah, that's great advice. And I think too, we've discovered during the pandemic how there really is so much on the internet in terms of learning and through whether it's research or going to the Ask Me Anything sessions,
Right.
which is great. What advice would you give to students? You just talked about the networking or building relationships with professionals in this industry. So, if they're feeling a little bit shy or a little bit intimidated, what tips would you give them?
I think you're right. The volunteering, saying I'll do something for free. If you're interested in a site, whether it's Old Salem or some other particular site, visit it online, visit it in person and possible. I think the more that you can experience of a particular site that you're interested in beforehand, that may give you some ideas about where you may be able to connect or where you may want to focus if you're talking about a career. But I would definitely say experience that particular location if you can.
Yes, every time we go on a vacation, I drag my family to historic sites, but
Yeah. Yes, 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 yes. I understand the dragging part too. We just
you
need
know,
to go together, Catherine.
we
I mean,
do
Miss
because then I
Michelle.
get dragged to, let's tour the football stadium and I guess those are historic sites too in
Yeah,
some places.
yes, they can be.
Yes. So I wonder if we could turn now to the people of
Mhm.
Salem.
Mhm.
What is the most interesting thing, and this may be more than, of course, one thing,
Yes,
that you learned in all of your extensive research and training about the people who lived there?
they were just like us. I think we tend to look at how they lived and the tools that they used and the way that they dressed and just think they were from another planet or something. But I think that's one thing that I have enjoyed so much about doing historical research, particularly reading something like the records of the Moravians in North Carolina, is that you see the personal stories. You hear the what they were doing in their lives, and you realize that they have the same emotions and heartbreaks and joys and dreams, struggles that we do. It's just the exterior part of it was different, but the interior, the soul and the people were all very much the same. And I think that's something I just never really considered. And I had mentioned earlier how history has changed over the time, the study of history. I think when I was growing up, the study of history was all about dead white men who had fought in wars, and you had to learn all those dates, their names and their dates, and that was it. And over the last few decades, there was a period where there was a desire to bring in more the study of the common man, not just the old white men who were the generals and the presidents and the, you know, the barons, whatever, the wealthy. But it was still a study of a lot of white men. And so it has gradually opened up. I mean, unfortunately, at that time period in history, the white men were the ones that things were written about, and they were the ones who were writing the history. And so there's a whole lot more information on them. But gradually we're starting to recognize that there are other people, there are other voices, and those are being teased out. I mean, unfortunately, it's taken a long time to do it. Women and African Americans and Cherokee, where Old Salem includes, is trying so hard to include the voices of those unheard and the faces of those unseen, and recognize their gifts, their talents, and major contributions. And that's not just at Old Salem, but that is how history has changed in my lifetime. Just the study of it, it has opened it up more to be more inclusive. And I think that's critical. And Old Salem has done a great job of that. And under Frank's time there as president, has even broadened that further, much further. And I think that's exciting. And now I got off on a tangent, and I don't even know what your question was.
No, that was great. I was just asking about the most interesting thing you learned
Oh.
about the people, but you did answer that with,
Okay.
seeing, and that's one of the things that I think is compelling to me about history too, is that, like you said, these are people and they had emotions and
Right,
fears and like you said, dreams, just like we do.
right, right, exactly.
And I think it is so much more interesting to get the well-rounded picture of
Mhm.
everyone's voices rather than
Right,
just those who, wanted us to know the good stuff
right,
about them.
exactly. Right, right, right. Good point. Wanted us to not only know about them, but only the good stuff about them.
Right,
Very good
exactly.
point.
What about the most surprising thing that you uncovered?
Um, I guess probably to me, in doing, again, reading about the personal lives through the records of the Moravians, I guess the thing that most surprised me is I knew that this was a group, a church group that founded Salem, a very tight group. You actually had to be a member of the Moravian Church to live in Salem and had to sign an agreement to follow certain rules. So it was tight, and there were restrictions. And if you didn't follow the restrictions, you might be asked to leave Salem. It was, that much of a situation. But I guess what surprised me is that there were always people breaking the rules. There were always people doing things they weren't supposed to be doing and getting into trouble. And those are the things that you read out about every now and then. And sometimes the church would be forgiving of their situation, and sometimes they would not be. It really would vary. But I think the thought that there were all these perfect people, it was the history through the rose-colored glasses, which it was not. Like I say, they were real people, and that realness, I think, was a surprise, and yet was what was also drew me in, maybe.
Yeah, and that's reminds me of like the Puritans and coming and
Mhm.
establishing Plymouth and the very tight restrictions on the community and the
Right.
people who were banished for not following the rules. But like you called earlier, the scamps who would come through town or whatever. I guess they had those in the community as well as outside the
Well,
community.
exactly, exactly. And they did things that were wrong, and they did things that were bad. Nobody was perfect. I mean, I think we tend to a lot of times paint this gloss over history. Sometimes it's things were more perfect or maybe worse than they were, and it's a mix of it all.
Sure. So that leads me into my next question about the daily life. What was that like if you want to pick out maybe the women or the families or the children, whichever direction?
Well, let's see. Let's I'll talk about the women. That would be good because that's a voice that's not always heard. And at that time period, most women were very definitely second-class citizens and had to pretty much get married to be able to have a life. They couldn't own property on their own. In Salem, it was a very different story. The Moravians have always been more accepting of women and accepting of women even in leadership positions, accepting of the gifts of women. Let's put it that way. They did educate girls, which in that time period was not done in most places. And that's how Salem College even came to be today, is because they were educating their young girls, and that grew, and other people wanted to send their daughters, and so it just continued to grow. So women were considered a value. They were educated. A single woman in that time period in Salem could choose to remain single and be self-supporting, and she had a place to live. She would live in the single sister's house with the other single women, but she had to pay to be able to live there. She had to pay for her room and board. So she would do that by either cooking or doing laundry for the single women, or maybe even doing laundry for the rest of the town. And unfortunately, they were still primarily domestic, type work that women do. But they might be making gloves to sell in the stores. They might be teaching in the girls' school. And so they had some other opportunities, or they might actually be providing domestic work in one of the family homes. But the fact that they were even able to have a job and be self-supporting. And then sometimes after women married, if their husband died and he worked at a particular trade, she had been helping him with that particular trade over the years. There are a few situations that she would even take over the trade and continue running it. And again, I think that was not common in all that time period for women to have that degree of autonomy, just in life in general.
Yeah, that's interesting. When we talk about women and education and really sort of looking at the reform movement in class in the 1830s, students always bring up, well, wait a minute, what about Salem College? How long has that been around? And Salem Academy, and of course it predates that time period of the real push in the rest of the country
Right.
for educating women.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked about architecture, and you talked about the German and the English architecture. What were some of the unique architectural styles and artifacts that we can even see today by visiting Old Salem?
Actually, if you go online, you can sign up. You'll be able to sign up for some architecture walking tours, I think, starting this summer. So if architecture is an interest of yours, I'd encourage you to do that. When the Moravians first came to Salem, they were predominantly a Germanic group. And I say Germanic, they weren't all from Germany. They were predominantly from Europe. But they did bring with them the building technology that they had learned basically at home, which was a more Germanic style. And they used that originally in their earlier buildings, are definitely in that style, called a Flurkuchen house, just with a central chimney. and basically 3 or 4 rooms surrounding that. But they had to use the building materials that were here. So sometimes they weren't always able to use this exactly same building materials that they were used to at home. So they had to adapt a little bit. But in the earlier buildings, you will see that half timbered. And if you think about, if you've been to Old Salem and think about any of the buildings there, a lot of the times it looks like sort of a window sash, sort of checkerboard wood, and then it would be filled, the squares filled in with either brick or nogging or a plaster type material. That is a very German style that they started out with. If any of you are familiar with the Single Brothers House in Salem, which is an iconic building, if any of you have visited, it's a very long building that looks really strange when you look at it because it was built in 2 time periods and in 2 different architectural styles. So the first half of it is very Germanic, half timbered. The second half of it, when they added on many years later, they were starting to be influenced more by the outside world, as we all are, aren't we? And they were adopting an English style, all brick with a Flemish bond. So that building is an incredible example of just 2 architectural styles just smashed together, just almost literally. The Moravian hood that you see around even some buildings today, that sort of arched hood, is a architectural feature that I think is just typical of Salem. I think Frederick William Marshall, who was sort of the architect of Salem, may have designed that, because I don't know that people have found that other places. But if you again go to the website, there is a place where you can check out the various types of architecture in town. So I'd encourage you, if that's something you're interested in, and definitely check out the architecture walking tours because they're fascinating.
I'm so glad you told me about that. I'm going to definitely take advantage of that. And I did not realize that about the arch being unique to Salem.
Mhm.
That's really interesting. What about some of the traditions?
The traditions of the Moravians, I think, are again fascinating, because a lot of those are traditions that have stayed fairly isolated in the Moravian Church. The traditions of the love feast, which is a church service. If any of you have ever experienced that, it's a great service. I love it. It's just having a little coffee break in the middle of church. So it's basically a service. It's not communion. If any of you are Christian and know what communion is, it does not take the place of that at all. It is a worship service that's primarily a service of music. There is usually a small sermon. I think they may call it a homily, but usually a small sermon. But during the middle of the music, the men and women come out from the back with trays, first of all, passing Moravian love feast buns. It's like a little hamburger bun, but it has some spices in it like cinnamon and cardamom and nutmeg. So it's just a little sweet, but there's not a hamburger or anything on it. It's just a plain bun. It could use some maybe butter or jelly sometimes, but anyway, everyone is passed a bun, and then everyone is passed a mug of Moravian coffee, even children. And it is coffee with cream and sugar in it. You can't order a latte or a macchiato. Everyone's passed a cup of coffee, and you just sit in the middle of worship and you enjoy your little coffee break. It's wonderful. It's a time of communal sharing, just experiencing a common meal together. So it really is a great service. I recommend that you try that out. Sometimes there are variations on it. There are often children's love feasts where they maybe serve tea or an iced tea or a lemonade in the summertime or a cookie, or the food doesn't matter. And the food that is served actually around the world varies, depending on the climate where the Moravian Church is and the time of year. So the food doesn't matter at all. The Moravian Star is another one of the traditions that I love, that developed actually out of a geometry project in a Moravian boys' school in Germany. If you think of taking a flat piece of paper and making a 26-pointed star out of it. You can imagine the geometry involved in it. And that just has become another symbol of the Moravian Church, of the light of Christ. And people have just embraced it as a decorative element, and you see it everywhere in homes and buildings and non-Moravian year-round. It's just become one of those iconic images. The Easter sunrise service is another one that's a tradition. And a lot of churches do the Easter sunrise service, but the Moravians do it in a way that like no one else does. And in Old Salem, there will truly be thousands of people that will gather in the cold and the dark of Easter morning, and then we'll walk from the Salem Square all the way to the graveyard as bands are playing in Tivoli. It's a really interesting and wonderful experience. And of course, they're the Moravian cookies that everybody loves, the really thin cookies, really ginger spicy. Those are probably the ones that are easiest to explain. I don't know if you want me to talk about a choir system or any other. Are you familiar with a choir system, or how our time is doing? You tell me, Catherine.
So we've got we're coming up on the hour. So
Okay.
yeah, I just like I
Let's
said
move
earlier,
on.
want to respect your time. But my last two questions were really just about gender equality, but
Yes.
that ties into the choir system, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes. Yes, it does actually.
Okay, cool. So
Uh,
that'd be a great segue.
One of the interesting traditions they had is that they lived in choir groups, and I don't mean singing choirs, even though they did sing a lot. For them, a choir group was determined by a person's age, their marital status, and their gender. And everyone in town was placed in a choir. They were a member of a choir. And of course, your status changed over your life. So for instance, and we always like to talk about the women and the girls because they had an identifying feature in their caps that they wore around their heads, which were just typical in fashion for the day. They would tie a ribbon, usually a silk ribbon, and that was, not cheap at that day. The color of the ribbon identified the choir you were in. So for the little girls, they wore bright red ribbons. The older girls wore burgundy ribbons. The single sisters wore pink, married sisters white, and married sisters blue, and widows white. Now, men were in the same groups by age and by gender. They just didn't wear a ribbon that indicated what group they were in. But your life revolved around that group. It was considered basically a support group, if you will. And for the single men and the single women, the single men lived in a house all together. That's what the single brothers' house is. And the counterpart to that, of course, is the single women's house. But when they married, husband and wife would live in their own family home together. So it was just a way to be able to understand life experiences better. If you're trying to understand those life experiences were people going through the same thing you were, essentially.
I was
So
just
that was,
what a wonderful. I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was just thinking we could definitely use those groups today.
You know what? I think so. I think that's true. That there's a lot of great ideas behind that.
Like you said, the support group.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And just my last question, which you touched on a little bit already
Mm-hmm.
as well, but about slavery in Salem.
And that's something that is again, Salem has a lot of situations that they don't fit quite the mold historically of other things that were going on in the world. In the time of Salem, early Salem, we're talking about Salem in the 1770s, we'll say, and the earlier years. The Moravian Church basically forbade individuals to own slaves. They felt like it would make a person lazy. However, there were certain needs in the community that required a lot of labor, and they felt like slave labor was needed in certain areas. So for instance, at one of the church-owned businesses like the tavern, slaves were owned by the church and worked, for instance, at the tavern. Or if there was a certain building project you needed a lot of labor for, you might hire a slave from the church. So it's this odd sort of situation. However, at that same time period, if an African American wanted to become a member of the Moravian Church, they went through the same sort of screening and training that any person would. If they were accepted, as any other person, if they were accepted and were allowed to become a member and baptized in the church, that person was considered to be a spiritual equal, even though they were in fact property. And it's something that is so strange for us to try to even wrap our heads around it. None of it makes sense, really. But in those early years, for instance, slave and master were buried side by side in the graveyard. Now, as I mentioned earlier about architecture and how they had become influenced by outside people over the years, that also happened with this whole issue of racial equality. Over the years, they were becoming more influenced by the people around them who owned slaves, maybe plantations and lots of slaves, and they were treated very differently. And the Moravians were influenced by that. And so even those people who were spiritual equals were slowly sort of separated from the church. It didn't happen overnight. They might first be not able to participate in an element of the service called the Kiss of Peace, or they might be moved to the back of the church where before they'd been sitting side by side with master and slave together, until finally a separate church was built for them. So it was this very slow process of segregating. That was, it's sort of heartbreaking to hear about it, because they were closer to the right idea in the beginning, even though they weren't quite there, but they went backwards. But anyway, that's just part of the history. Today, Old Salem is really trying to hear more clearly those voices through the project called Hidden Town, where we are actually identifying the locations where African Americans lived within Salem. And there's a lot of great information online, again, that identifies those people, where they worked and where they lived. And that's an ongoing research project.
That's fascinating. Thank you for taking us through that history. And so, like I said, I wanted to be respectful of your time, but it would just leave it up for any other questions can be put in the chat or Amita.
I actually have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
What made you decide to start working there?
What made me decide to start working there?
Yes.
I think it's that I needed a change in my life, to be honest with you. And at that point, working at Old Salem seemed like something fun. And that sounds, I'm almost embarrassed to tell you how silly that sounds now, but it just seemed like something fun to do. I did not grow up here, so I didn't know anything about the Moravians and didn't know anything about Salem until I moved here. And then I just kind of fell in love with it. Does that answer your question, Heather?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yes. Do you have any other questions?
Do you think that if you never worked like being in interior design, that you would have done this in the beginning?
That's a really good question. Actually, background is in interior design is what brought me to Old Salem. So I guess that's what the connector, I mean, brought me to Winston-Salem. I guess that's what the connector was. I lived in Memphis, Tennessee at the time before I came here. So I really don't think my interior design had really anything to do with me ending up at Old Salem, but there were times that I was actually able to marry that background in interior design with my love of Salem in my retail opportunities. So I was able to combine them. But I couldn't have foreseen that.
Yeah, and she said thank you. Those are great questions, Heather.
Yes.
And I think, again, so important for students to hear that they can take a job because it sounds like fun. And really probably should.
Yeah,
take those
exactly.
opportunities.
It makes my life worth living better if you're enjoying what you're doing.
Easier to get out of bed in the morning, for
Yes.
sure. Yes. Well, thank you so much for spending this time with us. And I know you're a wealth of knowledge of all things Old Salem and the town of Salem. So I appreciate you sharing your experience, your expertise, your knowledge with us. It's been so fun.
Well, you are welcome. I encourage people to go to the website and go to Old Salem when you can. And there are some opportunities that you can take advantage of even right now. So
Yes, and then I guess the walking tours too. Even I know we won't be completely out of COVID this summer, but being outside.
right, there's some outside opportunities, and there are a lot of Zoom classes. So there are lots of opportunities for things that you can do right now. There are online learning in place episodes that are fascinating. Old Salem is on TikTok, so there's lots that you can there's lots that you can find out. Check out their website; it's a great resource.
Great, that's so cool. Yeah, thank you, Heather, for coming. And Heather said thank you. I kind of cut her off there.
Thank you, Heather.
And thank you so much for being with us. And I hope that you have a great evening. And I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Yes.
With you at other times.
Me too. Thank you. This has been fun. Thank you so much.
It has been fun for me as well. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Sure. Bye.
Bye.